For 41 years, I believed my marriage to Richard was the quiet, enduring kind that people envy, the sort built on shared dreams, small sacrifices, and the steady accumulation of memories in one beloved place. Looking back now, in the harsh light of December 2025, I can see how every detail of that life, the scent of cedar shingles warming in the sun, the hum of the Deschutes River below our deck, the way the lavender fields turned silver in moonlight, was woven so tightly into my identity that I never imagined it could unravel. But it did, thread by thread, long before I knew. Richard and I met in the fall of 1982 at Oregon State University in Corvallis. I was 20, buried in nursing textbooks and clinical rotations, determined to make something stable out of the chaos of my parents' divorce. He was 22, a forestry major with calloused hands, sun-bleached hair, and a quiet intensity that made people listen when he spoke about the woods. We were introduced at a campus environmental club meeting. He was presenting on old growth preservation. I was there for extra credit. Afterward, he walked me back to my dorm through drizzling rain, holding his jacket over both our heads. He asked if Elle liked bonfires on the coast. I said yes, before I could overthink it. That first weekend, we drove to Lincoln City in his rattling Ford pickup, windows fogged, cassette tapes of Jackson Browne and Emmylou Harris playing too loud. We gathered driftwood, roasted hot dogs, and talked until the fire burned to embers. He told me about growing up in Klamath Falls, hunting with his father, losing his mother to breast cancer when he was 12. I told him about my father's sudden departure when I was 16, how nursing felt like a way to fix things that couldn't be fixed. By the time the sun rose over the Pacific, I knew I was in trouble. The good kind. We dated steadily through college. He proposed on graduation day, May 1984, on the same beach where we'd had that first bonfire. No ring yet, just a piece of fishing line tied around my finger, and a promise to replace it as soon as he had a real job. We married 3 months later in my childhood church in Salem, a small ceremony with wildflowers I'd picked myself and a reception in my aunt's backyard. My dress was simple ivory lace from a consignment shop. His suit was borrowed from his brother Mark. We honeymooned in a borrowed cabin near Sisters, cooking over a campfire and making plans that felt infinite. In the fall of 1984, Richard started as a seasonal ranger with the Forest Service in the Deschutes National Forest. I worked nights at St. Charles and Bend so we could save for a down payment. We rented a tiny apartment above a garage-thin walls, 1 bedroom, a kitchen so small we had to dance around each other to make dinner. But it was ours. We painted the walls sunflower yellow, hung posters of ancient forests, and dreamed out loud about the house we'd own someday. Riverview, big deck, space for kids and dogs. That house came in 1989. We found it almost by accident, an older cedar-shingled 2-story on Aubrey Butte, listed at $148,000. It was a stretch on his permanent ranger salary and my part-time clinic shifts, but the realtor saw how we looked at it and knocked $8,000 off the asking price. The day we signed the papers, we stood on the sagging back deck and watched the Deschutes glitter far below. Richard put his arm around me and said, "This is T. Laura, our forever place." It needed everything. The kitchen linoleum curled at the edges. The pine paneling was dark and dated. The yard was mostly dirt and ponderosa pine needles. We worked on it every weekend for years. We stripped wallpaper until our fingers bled, refinished the oak floors on our hands and knees, with rented sanders that shook our bones. Richard built the wide back deck himself. Douglas fir beams, sturdy enough for 100 Thanksgiving dinners. I planted lavender in the rocky soil along the driveway, starting with 20 cuttings from a friend's garden. By 1995, it had spread into waving purple fields that perfumed the whole neighborhood in June. Our daughters arrived like punctuation marks on the story we were writing. Emily in April 1991, dark hair like her father, a lusty cry that made the nurses laugh. Grace in September 1994, green eyes like mine, quiet and observant even as a newborn, the house adjusted to them, baby gates at the stairs, finger paints on the refrigerator, tricycles on the deck. Richard coached their soccer teams, built a tree fort in the big ponderosa out front, taught them to fish with patience that made me love him more. I cut back onto home health nursing so Elle could be there for school drop-offs and fevers at 2 a.m. We weren't trying to be perfect parents, just present ones. The years layered themselves like growth rings on a tree. Christmases with a real tree cut from the forest, permit approved, of course. Easters with egg hunts in the lavender. 4th of July's watching fireworks over the river from our deck. Emily's first heartbreak in high school. Richard sat with her on the porch swing until dawn. Grace's science fair volcano that actually erupted baking soda lava all over the kitchen. We laughed until we cried while cleaning it up. College move-in days, Emily to Portland for graphic design. Grace to Denver for environmental science, following her father's footsteps. The house grew quieter, but Richard and I filled the space with new rituals. Sunday crosswords on the deck. Friday night, steaks on the grill. Winter evenings by the River Rock fireplace with a bottle of Pinot from the Willamette Valley. We paid off the mortgage in June 2022. Richard was 61. I was 59. We invited the girls home, opened a bottle of Dom Perignon someone had given us years earlier, and toasted on the deck at sunset. The Cascades glowed pink and gold. The river sang below. Richard took my hand and said, "We did it, Laura. We really did it. This place is ours free and clear." I believed him with every cell in my body. There were small cracks I dismissed. His longer solo hikes in his late 50s, sometimes overnight, without much explanation, the work consultations in Boise or Salem that took him away for weekends. He'd come home tired but affectionate, bringing me little gifts, a piece of agate from a trail, lavender soap from a farm stand. I told myself men need space, that after decades together, a little independence was healthy. We still held hands walking the river trail, still made love with the windows open to summer nights, still finished each other's sentences. I thought the foundation was solid. In 1995, the same year Emily started kindergarten, Richard quietly bought a $600,000 whole life insurance policy through the state employees plan. He sat me down at the kitchen table one evening, papers spread out, and explained it carefully. "If anything happens to me, you'll never have to worry. The house is covered, your retirement, whatever you need. It's for you, Laura. Always for you." I kissed him and teased him about being morbid. We filed the paperwork away and rarely spoke of it again. By 2025, the lavender fields were legendary in Bend people. Stopped to take photos in June, asked if they could buy bundles at the gate. I turned it into a small side business. Sachets, essential oil, wreaths for the holidays. Richard had risen to district supervisor, respected for his calm handling of wildfires and his mentorship of young rangers. We talked loosely about retirement, maybe travel to Yellowstone, maybe volunteer together on trail crews. The house felt complete. Photos lining the stairs, Emily's artwork on the walls, Grace's childhood rock collection still on the sunroom windowsill. I see now that I was living inside a story I thought was finished. Pages neatly bound, every board in that deck, every lavender plant, every memory etched into those walls. I thought they belonged to us alone. I thought 41 years of choosing each other every day had earned us immunity from the kind of wreckage that happens to other people. I was wrong. The wreckage had already begun years earlier in places I never looked. While I was planning Lavender and nursing patients and raising our daughters and loving him with everything I had, Richard was building another life one with weekends in Boise. Children who called him Daddy, a woman who believed she was his only wife. But in the spring of 2025, standing on our paid-off deck watching another perfect sunset, I still believed our story was unbreakable. I still believed the house on Aubrey Butte, the lavender fields, the river view, the life we'd poured 41 years into was ours alone. That belief died with him 3 months later. The spring of 2025 felt almost mercifully ordinary at first, a gentle reprieve after the quiet worries I'd carried about Richard's increasing distance. The lavender was pushing up new green shoots earlier than usual, the river ran high with snowmelt from the Cascades, and Richard seemed energized by the longer days. He'd taken to early morning hikes again, something he hadn't done as regularly in his late 50s, when his knees bothered him. "Gotta stay ahead of the old man creep," he joked one evening on the deck, flexing dramatically while I laughed and handed him a beer. I noticed he'd lost a little weight. Sharper cheekbones, the veins in his forearms standing out more, but I attributed it to cleaner eating and those hikes. He looked good, actually. Vital. I told myself the extra solo time was healthy, that after 41 years together, a man was allowed his private rituals with the forest. June arrived warm and fragrant. The girls were planning visits, Emily talking about bringing her new boyfriend up from Portland for the 4th. Grace hinting at a long weekend from Denver to help me distill the first lavender harvest. Richard and I marked our 41st anniversary quietly on June 8th with takeout Thai on the deck and a bottle of Willamette Valley Pinot we'd been saving. He gave me a small carved cedar box he'd made in secret, a replacement for the one that had cracked years ago. Inside was a new piece of agate he'd found on a trail, polished smooth, the bands and swirling in grays and ambers. "Still picking rocks for you?" he said, kissing my temple. I teased him about being sentimental in his old age. We made love that night slowly, familiarly, the windows open to the sound of the river. Everything felt, if not perfect, then peacefully settled. Like the long middle chapter of a book you're content never to finish. The morning it happened was Thursday, June 19th. I remember because I had an early home health visit scheduled with Mrs. Callahan, the 92-year-old widow on the west side whose stories about Depression era Ben and I secretly loved. Richard was up before me, as usual on hike days. I heard him moving quietly in the kitchen, coffee percolating, the soft clink of his metal mug, the rustle of his pack. He came back into the bedroom around 5:45, already dressed in his favorite faded green Forest Service cap, lightweight hiking pants, and the merino wool shirt I'd bought him for Christmas. He bent over the bed and kissed my forehead. "Heading to Tumalo Falls," he whispered. "Should be back by 10 or 11. Love you." I mumbled something sleepy and affectionate, already drifting again. His text came at 6:12 a.m., a photo of the sunrise spilling rose gold light over the waterfall, mist rising like steam from the plunge pool. The caption, "Beautiful morning, love you," I smiled, heartful, and forwarded it to the girls with a note. Your dad's at it again, Emily replied with a heart emoji. Grace sent a voice note laughing about how he'd never change. By 7:30, I was at Mrs. Callahan's, checking her blood pressure and listening to her recount the 1945 flood. At 7:45, my phone rang. Unknown number, I stepped onto her porch to take it. A man's voice, calm but urgent. Mrs. Thompson, this is Ranger Alvarez from Deschutes. Your husband Richard collapsed on the Tomalo Falls Trail. We've got medics with him now and life flight en route to St. Charles. Can you meet us there? The world narrowed to a tunnel. I apologized to Mrs. Callahan, promised to reschedule, and drove the familiar roads on autopilot through downtown Bend, past the old mill, over the bridge where the river sparkled mockingly in the morning sun. I called Emily first. She was already crying when she answered. Grace didn't pick up. Later, Elle learned she was on a field survey with no signal. I left a voicemail that I hate remembering, my voice cracking, trying to sound steady, saying only, "Daddy's had a medical emergency. Come when you can." I reached the ER trauma bay before the helicopter. They let me stand in the corridor while the team worked, paddles, drugs, shouted numbers I recognized from my nursing days, but couldn't process. A doctor finally came out. Young, kind eyes behind the mask. Massive myocardial infarction. We've stabilized him for now, but there's significant heart damage. He's unconscious. We're moving him to ICU. The next 40 hours blurred into a haze of fluorescent lights, beeping monitors, and the antiseptic smell that never quite leaves your clothes. Richard lay there looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, tubes in his arms, ventilator breathing for him. The strong hands that had built our deck now swollen and bruised from IVs. Emily arrived first, red-eyed from the drive, collapsing into my arms in the waiting room. Grace landed late that night, rented car straight from Redmond Airport, still in her field clothes and boots. We took shifts at his bedside. The neurologist explained the scans. Prolonged lack of oxygen during resuscitation had caused profound brain injury. "We'll know more in 24 hours, she said gently, but her face told the truth. We played his favorite music softly. John Prine, Gillian Welch, the playlist we'd made for road trips. Emily read him passages from his favorite Edward Abbey book. Grace held his hand and told him about the restoration project she was leading on the Metolius, voice fierce as if willing him to wake up and argue about methodology. I sat for hours, stroking his forehead, whispering memories. Our first apartment, the day we brought Emily home, the night we paid off the mortgage. I told him it was okay to rest, that we'd be all right, that I loved him more than ever. Family and friends filtered through. Mark drove up from Klamath Falls, sat silently for an hour, staring at his big brother. Richard's old crew from the Forest Service came in uniforms, hats in hands, telling stories of the rookie who once wrestled a black bear away from a campsite, exaggerated, but we smiled. Anyway. Neighbors brought coffee and sandwiches we barely touched. On Saturday evening, June 21st, the doctors gathered us in the family room with its terrible beige walls and tissue boxes on every table. The latest EEG was flat. No meaningful brain activity. Organs beginning to fail despite support. "We can keep him on the ventilator as long as you need," the intensivist said, "but he's not coming back." Emily sobbed into Grace's shoulder. Grace stared at the floor, jaw clenched. Mark reached over and squeezed my hand, the same hand that had held Richard's for 2 days straight. We talked through the night in that room. What would Richard want? We knew. He'd filled out the advance directive years ago after a colleague's prolonged ordeal. No heroics, no machines, keeping a shell alive. He wanted to be an organ donor if possible. He wanted his ashes scattered onto Malo Mountain, where he'd proposed to me on a winter snowshoe 41 years earlier. At 11:47 p.m., we gathered around the bed me, the girls Mark. They turned off the monitor's alarm so the only sound was the hiss of the ventilator. I held his left hand, Emily his right. Grace rested her head on his chest. The nurse slowly withdrew support. His heart, stubborn to the end, kept its own rhythm for 7 more minutes. Then it stopped. The silence was enormous. We stayed until they asked us to leave, until the sheets were pulled up and the machines wheeled away. I kissed his forehead one last time, cool already, and whispered, "Thank you for everything." The days that followed were a merciful blur of necessary tasks. Choosing the simple pine casket he would have liked. Writing the obituary together at the kitchen table where we'd done homework and taxes and birthday planning. Arranging the service at the community center, overlooking the river rangers in dress uniforms. A bagpiper, because Richard loved the sound at Celtic festivals. Wildflowers gathered from trails he'd managed. Neighbors filled our house with casseroles, cards, quiet hugs. People told stories I'd forgotten. How Richard once carried an injured hiker 3 miles out, how he mentored dozens of young rangers, how he always had time to teach kids about fire ecology at school visits. Elle functioned because I had to. The girls stayed 2 weeks, sorting his clothes for donation, keeping his favorite flannel shirts, boxing up gear, helping me answer the endless phone calls. We scattered a small portion of his ashes onto Malo Mountain on a clear July morning, just the 4 of us, Mark included. The rest waited in a simple cedar box on the mantel until we could decide. By mid-July, the house felt both too empty and too full of him. His coffee mug still in the dish rack, his hiking boots by the door. The faint scent of his cedar soap in the bathroom. The girls went back to their lives with promises to return soon. I walked the deck each evening, watching the river carry light downstream, telling myself grief was a long trail, but one I could hike one step at a time. Elle believed the worst was over. Elle believed the only theft Death had committed was taking Richard himself. I was wrong. The real theft, the one that would force me to bury him all over again, was already waiting on my porch in the form of a woman named Melanie and 2 children who carried his eyes. The weeks immediately following Richard's death passed in a strange, suspended rhythm, one where time seemed both to crawl and to vanish. The house on Aubrey Butte, once so full of his presence, now carried it like an echo, his favorite wool blanket still draped over the back of the couch, the faint scent of his cedar and pine soap lingering in the master bathroom, his reading glasses perched on the side table next to the novel he'd never finish. I moved through the rooms carefully, as though any sudden motion might disturb the fragile membrane between grief and normalcy. Neighbors continued to drop off food lasagnas, berry cobblers, loaves of banana bread wrapped in foil with sympathetic notes attached. I ate almost none of it. The girls had gone home after the scattering of the ashes onto Malo Mountain, promising to return soon, but their lives pulled them back. Emily's design deadlines, Grace's summer field season. I told them I was fine. I told myself the same thing every morning when I woke to an empty side of the bed. By mid-July, the lavender was in full, glorious bloom. The fields along the driveway shimmered purple under the high desert sun, drawing hummingbirds and tourists alike. I harvested in the early mornings, when the air was still cool and the scent was strongest, bundling stems with twine the way Richard used to help me every year. He'd always teased me about turning into a lavender baroness, but he'd been proud of the little business cutting straight rows, tying bundles with the same precision he brought to trail maintenance. I sold sachets and oil at the Saturday market downtown, chatting with customers about distillation techniques while my mind wandered to memories of him carrying crates for me, his forearms tanned and strong. The routine helped. The physical work quieted the constant ache, at least for a few hours. It was a Thursday afternoon, July 17th, exactly 4 weeks since the morning he'd texted me the sunrise photo from Tomalo Falls. I'd just come in from the garden, arms full of fresh-cut bundles, my hands stained purple at the fingertips. The house smelled of lavender and the lemon polish I'd used that morning in a burst of desperate energy. I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing stems when the doorbell rang. I assumed it was another neighbor, or perhaps the UPS driver with the new distiller parts I'd ordered. I dried my hands on the dish towel. The blue and white one we'd bought on our 20th anniversary trip to the Oregon coast, and walked to the front door. Through the sidelight window, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. Mid-50s, maybe a few years younger than me. Blonde hair pulled into a neat low bun, wearing a simple sleeveless sundress in pale sage green that looked expensive but understated. She held the hand of a little girl 4, perhaps 5, wearing a pink tutu over shorts and clutching a stuffed unicorn. A teenage boy stood slightly behind them on the porch steps, hands in his pockets, dark hair falling over eyes that were fixed on the ground. Something about his posture, the slope of his shoulders, the way he shifted his weight, sent a flicker of unease through me before I even opened the door. I turned the knob and pulled it open, just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" The woman looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying recently, but her expression was composed, almost rehearsed. She took a small, steadying breath. "Are you Laura Thompson?" she asked. Her voice was soft, educated, with a faint trace of an Idaho accent. "Yes," I said, my hand still on the door. She glanced down at the little girl, who was staring at my lavender-stained fingers with open curiosity, then back at me. "My name is Melanie Harper. This is Sophie and Jacob." She paused, swallowing. "I need to talk to you about Richard." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. I felt the ripples everywhere, chest, throat, fingertips. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The woman Melanie waited, her face pale now, lips pressed together. The boy finally looked up, and that was when the world truly tilted. He had Richard's eyes, not just the color hazel flecked with gold, but the shape, the slight upward tilt at the outer corners, the thick lashes I'd teased Richard about for decades. The same eyes that had looked at me across a bonfire in 1982. The same eyes I'd watched crinkle at the corners when he laughed at our daughter's terrible jokes. The same eyes I'd closed with my fingertips in the ICU 4 weeks earlier. I must have made some sound, a gasp, a whisper, because Melanie reached out as if to steady me, though she didn't touch me. "I'm so sorry to come like this," she said quickly. "I've been trying to find the right way. There isn't one. May we come in? Just for a few minutes?" My nursing training took over. Don't leave a child standing in the July heat. I stepped back and opened the door wider. "Of course. Come in." They entered slowly, almost reverently. Sophie's sandals made soft padding sounds on the oak floor I'd refinished with Richard in 1992. Jacob kept his hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room. The river rock fireplace, the built-in bookshelves lined with field guides and family photos, the framed picture of Richard in his ranger uniform on the mantel next to the cedar box holding what remained of his ashes. Melanie paused in the entryway, taking it all in with an expression I couldn't read. Sorrow, perhaps, mixed with something like wonder. Elle led them to the living room, the same room where we'd opened Christmas presents every year, where Emily had learned to walk, where Grace had cried over her first breakup. Sunlight poured through the big west-facing windows, illuminating dust motes in the air and the vase of fresh lavender I'd arranged that morning. I gestured toward the couch. "Please sit." Melanie and Sophie sat on the longer sectional. Jacob chose the armchair farthest away, perching on the edge as if ready to bolt. I took the ottoman across from them, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide their trembling. For a long moment, no one spoke. Sophie swung her legs, unicorn clutched to her chest. Finally, Melanie reached into her large canvas tote and pulled out a small photo album, leather-bound, well-worn. She opened it on the coffee table between us and turned it toward me. The first picture nearly stopped my heart. Richard younger, maybe 15 years ago, standing in front of a different house, arms around Melanie, both of them smiling at the camera. He wore the same easy grin I knew so well. Behind them, a toddler. Jacob sat on a porch step holding a plastic truck. I stared at it, unable to breathe properly. Melanie's voice was gentle. "I met Richard in 2005 on a wildfire mitigation project outside Boise. He was consulting for the Forest Service, was a landscape architect with the city. He told me his marriage had ended years earlier, that he was divorced but still close to his daughters. We fell in love. We had a commitment ceremony in 2008. Nothing legal, but meaningful to us. Jacob was born in 2007, Sophie in 2021. She turned the page. More photos. Richard teaching Jacob to fish in a different river. Richard pushing Sophie on a swing in a backyard I didn't recognize. Richard at a school play holding a bouquet of grocery store roses. In every one he looked happy, relaxed in a way Elle realized now Elle hadn't seen in years. My mouth was dry. He was never divorced, I managed. Melanie's eyes filled. I know that now. He kept saying he was waiting for the right time to tell you, that he didn't want to hurt you or the girls. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because Elle loved him. Sophie tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Where's Daddy Richard?" she whispered loudly. "You said we were going to see his house." Melanie's face crumpled for a second before she smoothed it again. She stroked Sophie's hair. "Remember, honey? Daddy Richard went to heaven. This is his other house. This is Laura's house." The little girl looked at me with wide, solemn eyes. Richard's eyes in miniature, and offered a shy wave. I waved back automatically, my hand moving without permission. Jacob spoke for the first time, voice low and rough with adolescence and grief. He talked about you all the time, said you were the strongest person he knew, said the Lavender farm was your idea, that you made everything beautiful. Elle looked at him, at this boy who carried my husband's bone structure, his quiet intensity, and felt something inside me fracture cleanly in two. Melanie reached into her bag again and pulled out a manila envelope. "There's more," she said quietly. "Things he changed legally. The life insurance, the house title. He wanted Jacob and Sophie provided for. He thought he could protect everyone." Her voice broke. "I didn't know about you until I read the obituary. I swear I didn't." I took the envelope with fingers that felt numb. Inside were documents I would study obsessively in the coming days. Beneficiary change forms dated January 2024. Trust amendments adding Melanie to the house title. Bank statements showing transfers I'd never seen. But in that moment, sitting in the living room filled with 41 years of my life with Richard, watching a 4-year-old girl who called him Daddy swing her legs on my couch. I couldn't process any of it. I could only stare at the photos, at the second family my husband had built, in the spaces I'd thought were merely his solitude. The lavender scent in the room, once my comfort, now felt cloying. Outside, the river kept moving, indifferent, and inside, the careful story I'd told myself about my marriage, about loyalty, about knowing someone completely after 4 decades, shattered into pieces too sharp to gather. Melanie stood eventually, gathering Sophie. Jacob rose too, still avoiding my eyes. At the door, she paused. "I'm so sorry, Laura, for all of this. I don't know what else to say." I nodded, unable to form words. I watched them walk down the path through my lavender fields, the fields Richard and I had planted together, get into a silver SUV with Idaho plates, and drive away. Then I closed the door, slid down the wall in the entryway, and cried until my throat was raw and my ribs ached. Not just for Richard's death, but for the death of everything I'd believed about us. The second funeral had begun. After Melanie, Jacob, and Sophie left that July afternoon, the house felt altered, contaminated almost, by the presence of Richard's other life. The living room couch still bore the faint indentations where they'd sat. Sophie's stuffed unicorn had left a single pink thread on the cushion. The lavender bundles I'd been rinsing lay forgotten in the sink, wilting under the faucet's slow drip. I stood in the entryway for a long time. The manila envelope Melanie had given me clutched to my chest, staring at the front door, as if expecting them to return and tell me it was all a mistake. But the driveway remained empty. The silver SUV with Idaho plates long gone. Eventually, I moved to the kitchen table, the same wide pine table where Richard and I had planned our daughter's college funds, celebrated promotions, argued over paint colors for the deck. I sat down and opened the envelope with hands that still trembled from the shock. Inside were neatly organized documents, photocopies mostly, with a handwritten note from Melanie on pale blue stationery. "Laura, I'm sorry to leave this with you like this. Richard wanted both families taken care of. I didn't know the full picture until after. Please believe I never meant to hurt you. M." The first document was a beneficiary change form for the $600,000 whole life insurance policy. The one Richard had sat me down to explain in 1995, promising it was for me and the girls. The form was dated January 17th, 2024, signed in Richard's unmistakable blocky handwriting. Primary beneficiary: Melanie Harper, listed as domestic partner. Contingents: Jacob Richard Harper and Sophie Grace Harper. My name appeared nowhere, not even as an alternate. A sticky note in Richard's hand was attached to the copy. "For the kids' future college house security. Laura has the house and pension." I stared at those words until they blurred. The house and pension. As if that balanced the scales. Next came bank statements for an account I'd never seen opened in 2006 at a credit union in Boise, solely in Richard's name. Monthly transfers from our joint checking account, small at first, $200 to $300, growing over the years to $1,000 or more. Total over 2 decades, $152,437.62. Line items for mortgage payments on a townhouse in Meridian. LD Ho. Private school tuition for Jacob at a Boise Montessori through 8th grade, then a Catholic high school, orthodontist bills, summer camps in the Sawtooths, a family Disney cruise in 2019. There were deposits too. Richard's overtime pay, consulting fees from wildfire gigs, bonuses he'd told me were going into our retirement savings. I remembered him coming home from those weekend trainings with new hiking gear or a tired smile, saying the extra money would help with the girls' college loans. I'd kissed him and thanked him for working so hard. I felt physically ill. I pushed back from the table and barely made it to the powder room before retching. Inside were subfolders: bank, photos, letters. Elle opened bank first scans of the same statements Melanie had shown me, plus spreadsheets Richard had kept meticulously tracking transfers. One column labeled L for me and the girls' mortgage payoff, college contributions, another labeled M for Melanie House, kids' expenses, balanced almost to the penny, as if fairness could be calculated in dollars. The photos folder held thousands of images I'd never seen. Jacob's birth announcement, Sophie's first steps in a different backyard, Christmas mornings with a tree Elle hadn't decorated. Richard holding newborn Sophie in a hospital room, looking exhausted and radiant the way he had with our own daughters. A selfie of him and Melanie on a beach in Hawaii, time-stamped February 2022, the same month he'd told me he was at a mandatory training in Salem. Elle opened letters last. Dozens of drafts, some sent, some not. Emails to Melanie spanning 20 years love notes, logistical planning, apologies for missed weekends. One from 2012. I hate lying to Laura. She doesn't deserve this, but walking away would destroy her and the girls. I'm a coward, Melanie's reply. Then stop promising you'll leave and just love us the way you can. Another from early 2024 after the beneficiary change. It's done. The policy will take care of you and the kids if anything happens. Laura will have the house free and clear, and my pension. She'll be comfortable. I can't do more without breaking her world. There was one draft never sent, dated the week before he died. Mel, I've been having chest pain on hikes. If something happens, tell Laura gently. Tell her I loved her first and longest. Tell her the house is hers. Truly. Burn this if you can. I called Mark that night. Richard's younger brother, the only family he had left after their parents passed. He answered on the second ring, voice thick with sleep. It was after midnight in Klamath Falls. Laura? Everything okay? No, I said. My voice sounded like someone else's. Flat, hollow. Melanie Harper came to the house today with Richard's other children. Silence stretched so long, Elle thought the call had dropped. Mark? He exhaled heavily. I'm sorry, Laura. I didn't know she'd come in person. You knew. Another silence. Then, he told me 15 years ago. Swore me to secrecy and said it was a mistake that got out of hand, that he'd end it, but he couldn't. He was terrified of losing you and the girls. I told him to come clean. He said he couldn't bear to see you hurt. Elle laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. So he hurt me worse instead. I know, God, I know. He was my brother, but he was wrong. I should have told you. We talked until dawn. Mark filled in pieces, Richard's guilt eating at him, the way he'd overworked to fund both lives, the heart issues he'd hidden because he didn't want to burden me. Mark had met Melanie once, accidentally, at a family funeral in 2018. Richard had begged him to keep quiet. Elle hung up as the sun rose over the river, feeling decades older than when it had set. Emily arrived the next afternoon, Grace the day after. Both dropping everything when Elle called and told them, voice-breaking, that their father had another family. We sat at that same kitchen table and went through every document together. Emily cried silently, tears dripping onto the insurance forms. Grace paced, furious, wanting to drive to Boise and confront Melanie. We read the emails aloud, voices trembling. We found more in Richard's cloud account birthday cards to Jacob and Sophie. He'd never mailed from home Father's Day messages from them calling him Dad. The girls were devastated in different ways. Emily kept saying, "How could he look at us every day and lie?" Grace focused on the money. "He stole from our college funds, from Mom's retirement, to pay for their Disney trips." Both refused to look at the photos of their half-siblings at first. Later, Emily did alone, crying over baby pictures of Sophie, who had Grace's same serious infant stare. We hired an attorney the following week, a sharp estate litigator in Bend recommended by a friend. Oregon's community property laws might protect half the insurance and invalidate the trust amendment if we could prove the funds weren't truly separate. But the legal path looked brutal. Depositions, financial forensics, possibly facing Melanie and the children in court. Some nights I walked the deck alone, staring at the dark river, wondering how many sunsets Richard had watched from another deck in Boise, holding another woman's hand. The lavender kept blooming, indifferent to betrayal. The house, our forever home now, felt like contested territory. And in the quiet hours, I mourned not just the man who died on a trail in June, but the man I thought I'd married in 1984. The paper trail laid bare a 20-year deception, calculated and compartmentalized, funded by lies I'd never suspected. The second funeral wasn't in a cemetery with bagpipes and wildflowers. It was here, in folders and spreadsheets and unsent emails, burying the myth of the life Elle thought we'd built together. One document haunted me most, a single yellow legal sheet in Richard's handwriting found tucked inside the laptop case. A letter to me, undated, unsent. "Laura, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and the truth is out. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it. You were my home, my conscience, my joy. I weakened and built something else on the side because Elle was selfish and scared of getting old alone in the parts of my life you couldn't fill. I tried to make it fair, but there's no fair in this. The house is yours. Fight for it. Forgive me if you can. If not, I understand. I loved you most. ER." Elle folded it carefully and put it back. Some days I wanted to burn it. Most days Elle just cried over the words "I loved you most," wondering if they were true or just another careful compartment in a life built on division. The days after discovering the full extent of Richard's deception blurred into a season of surreal limbo one, where the August sun still warmed the deck each morning, the lavender faded to silver seed heads, and the river kept its eternal rush below the house, but nothing inside me felt tethered to the world anymore. Emily and Grace stayed through most of August, their presence a lifeline I clung to, even as we navigated the wreckage together. We hired the estate attorney, Karen Nguyen, a calm, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with a reputation for fighting dirty when necessary. She spread the documents across our kitchen table, like evidence in a crime scene, and laid out the battlefield. Oregon's strong community property laws could likely invalidate much of the trust amendment and restore my claim to at least half the insurance proceeds. But it would require proving the funds Richard diverted were marital assets. Discovery would be brutal subpoenas for bank records, depositions of Melanie, possibly even testimony from the children. It could take years, Karen warned, and it will get personal. We decided to fight anyway. Not for vengeance, though anger burned hot on some days, but for the principle of what was ours. The house Richard and I had built with sweat and shared dreams wasn't half his to give away. The policy premiums had come from our joint efforts. Emily, ever the designer, channeled her rage into creating a timeline graphic of the transfers for the lawyer. Grace, the scientist, dove into forensic accounting with a ferocity that scared me sometimes. I handled the day-to-day phone calls with the insurer, who froze the payout pending litigation, meetings with Karen, endless paperwork. Melanie reached out once more in early September. A letter arrived. No return address, postmarked Boise. Inside was a short note in careful handwriting. Laura, I've been sick thinking about how Elle left things. I never wanted to blindside you. Richard always said you were the heart of his real life, that what we had was separate, something he fell into because he was afraid of aging, of emptiness. He changed the documents last year when his blood pressure spiked, and he thought he might not have long. He wanted the kids secure. He swore the house would stay yours. He even had me promise to disclaim any claim if it came to that. I didn't know the depth of the lies until after he passed. I thought your marriage ended amicably years ago. I grieve him too, but I grieve the man I thought he was. Jacob is angry. At his father, at the world. Sophie keeps asking why Daddy Richard doesn't visit anymore. I'm trying to shield them, but they feel the fracture. Elle won't contest the house. It's yours. You earned it. But the insurance, please consider the children. They've lost their father too. With regret, Melanie. I read it alone on the deck at twilight, the same spot where Richard and I had toasted our mortgage freedom 3 years earlier. Part of me wanted to burn the letter. Part of me ached for the children. Jacob's guarded eyes, Sophie's innocent wave. I showed it to the girls. Emily crumpled it in fury. Grace read it twice, then said quietly, "She's not wrong about the kids losing their dad, but neither are we." We forwarded it to Karen without reply. The legal machinery ground slowly. In October, the insurer formally interpleaded the funds, deposited the $600,000 into court registry to let us fight over it. Melanie's attorney, a polished firm in Boise, filed a claim on behalf of the children as named beneficiaries. Karen countered with motions alleging fraud, undue influence, though Richard wasn't impaired, and breach of spousal fiduciary duty. Discovery requests flew back and forth. We learned Melanie's townhouse was paid off. Jacob was on track for college scholarships. Sophie had a trust already seeded with $50,000 from Richard. It didn't make me hate them. It just made the imbalance sting more. I met Melanie once, unavoidably, in November. Karen arranged a mediation session in a neutral conference room in Portland Halfway for both of us. I drove up with Emily for moral support. Grace was in the field. Melanie arrived alone, looking thinner, wearing a simple navy dress. We sat across a long oak table with lawyers flanking us like armor. The mediator, a retired judge, outlined possible settlements, split the insurance 50-50 or 60-40 in my favor, with Melanie disclaiming any house interest. Melanie spoke softly when it was her turn. "I don't want Laura to lose her home," she said, eyes on the table. Richard was clear about that in his last months. He regretted the changes almost immediately, said he did it in a panic after a bad doctor visit. But the kids, Jacob wants to study forestry like his dad. Sophie's too young to understand, but she'll need things. Elle looked at her, then really looked. She was grieving too in her way. The man she'd built a life with had lied to her just as comprehensively, painting me as an ex-wife who'd moved on. We were both widows of different versions of the same man. I spoke for the first time. The house stays mine. That's non-negotiable. It's not about money. It's 41 years of our life together. My voice shook only a little. But the children didn't choose this. If we can avoid dragging them into depositions, we settled that day. I kept the house free and clear. Melanie disclaimed any interest. The insurance split 60-40 in my favor. $360,000 to me, $240,000 held in trust for Jacob and Sophie, with provisions for education and medical needs. Legal fees took a chunk from both sides, but it ended without trial. Karen called it a win. I called it survival. Thanksgiving came and went quietly, just the three of us at the table that once seated extended family. We scattered the rest of Richard's ashes onto Mallow Mountain in early December, snow dusting the pines. Emily and Grace met Jacob once, awkwardly, at a coffee shop in Bend when Melanie brought the children for a weekend visit to see Richard's favorite trails. Sophie gave me a drawing stick figures holding hands under a purple scribble sky labeled Lavender. I cried in the car afterward. I still walk the deck every evening. The river runs darker now in winter, the lavender fields dormant under frost. Some nights I talk to Richard. Not the myth, but the complicated man who loved imperfectly, who tried to keep too many plates spinning and dropped them all. I'm angry still. I miss him still. The ache has layers now. Grief for the husband who died on a trail. Grief for the marriage I thought was true. Grief for the innocence I can't reclaim. Melanie sends occasional updates, Jacob's college applications, Sophie starting preschool. I reply politely. The children are real. Blame can't land on them. Emily is designing a new line of greeting cards inspired, darkly, by fractured families. Grace planted a new lavender variety in the lower field last fall, one with deeper purple blooms, more resilient to drought. She named it Resolute. The house is mine, legally and emotionally, though it echoes differently now. I kept Richard's favorite flannel shirt, the one that still smells faintly of cedar, if I'll bury my face in it. I donated most of his gear, but held on to the carved cedar box he made for our anniversary, the one with the new agate inside. Sometimes I open it and roll the stone between my fingers, remembering the man who picked rocks for me on every trail. There were 2 funerals for Richard Thompson. The first was in June, with bagpipes and wildflowers and a community mourning a good man taken too soon. The second was quieter, stretched across months of revelations and reckonings, ending not with a casket, but with a settlement agreement and a divided legacy. Elle attended both alone in the end, and somehow, in the space between them, I'm learning to live in the house we built, scarred, complicated, but still standing. The river keeps moving, the lavender will bloom again come June. And I remain tending what's left, forgiving what I can, carrying the rest. Because love, even shattered, leaves roots that refuse to die.